There are people who finish everything that needed to be done and still can't stop. The day ends, the tasks are completed, yet resting feels wrong. What was done never seems enough. There is always the impression that it could have been more, better, more productive. A subtle guilt appears, as if stopping were a sign of weakness or carelessness. Billy Graham observed this state closely. For him, when resting feels like failure, it is not a lack of commitment. It is excessive self-pressure, an internal demand that remains active even when there is nothing left to do. The person does not rest because they feel they have not yet done enough to deserve stopping. This pressure does not begin when the day ends. It follows from the very beginning. Even before starting a task, there is already a high expectation about the result. During execution, the mind evaluates, compares, and presses. After finishing, instead of relief, review sets in. What was missing? What could have been better? What still was not done well enough? Even when everything is organized, something remains unfinished inside. There is no clear criterion that signals it is now allowed to stop. Rest does not appear as a natural consequence of effort, but as something that must be justified. And it almost never is. There always seems to be an invisible standard that has not been reached. Over time, this self-pressure stops, depending on external demands. No one needs to ask for more. The person takes on that role themselves. They pressure themselves before being pressured. They anticipate judgment. They keep moving so as not to make room for the feeling of failure. This state creates a very specific kind of exhaustion. It is not the fatigue of too many tasks, but the fatigue of never feeling enough. The body may ask for a pause, but the mind questions it. Rest begins to generate discomfort, not because the work continues, but because the internal pressure does not stop. Some confuse this with discipline or responsibility. But internally the experience is different. It is constant self-surveillance, a continuous effort to prove worth through performance. And while this logic remains active, rest is not experienced as a right, but as a risk. Recognizing this self-pressure does not dissolve it immediately, but it helps to see that the difficulty in stopping does not come from a lack of time or tasks, but from an internal standard that is never satisfied. And while that standard has no limit, rest will continue to feel like something that must be postponed. In this context, resting does not bring immediate relief. It brings discomfort. The person sits down, tries to stop, but something inside resists. The mind returns to what was done during the day and points out flaws. It questions whether the effort was sufficient. It suggests there is still something to improve, adjust, or anticipate. Rest is experienced as an improper interruption, not as a natural consequence of work. This guilt is rarely intense or explicit. It appears quietly, but persistently. A discomfort in not producing, a restlessness in not solving anything. The feeling that stopping now is wasting time or missing an opportunity to do more. Even when there is no real urgency, the mind creates one. Rest becomes tolerated only under certain conditions. After an extremely exhausting day, after accomplishing something considered big enough. Even then, it rarely comes without reservations. There is always the impression that it still was not enough, that the right to rest has not yet been fully earned. Over time, the person learns to negotiate with themselves. They rest but with guilt. They stop but keep thinking about what they could be doing. The body slows down, but the inner world remains in a constant state of evaluation. Rest stops fulfilling its purpose because there is no real surrender to it. Billy Graham observed that this difficulty did not come from a lack of desire to rest, but from a deep association between personal value and performance. When a person believes they are only worth what they produce, stopping becomes threatening. Resting feels like it puts their very sense of usefulness at risk. Thus, guilt settles in whenever the pace slows down. Not because rest is wrong, but because the person has learned to measure their value by continuous effort. And while this logic remains active, resting is not experienced as care, but as a failure to be corrected. Over time, effort stops being just one part of life and starts to define who the person believes they are. Personal value begins to be measured by how much one does, how much one endures, how much one gives without stopping. Producing becomes proof of merit. Exhaustion becomes a sign of commitment. Stopping then starts to seem suspicious. In this scenario, it is not enough simply to complete tasks. What matters is doing more than expected. Pushing beyond limits becomes routine. Internal recognition does not come from what was done, but from the feeling of having gone further. And even when that happens, the effect is short-lived. Soon, a new demand appears, a new standard, a new not yet. The person learns to observe themselves with the same rigor used to observe results. They evaluate their own performance all the time. There is no room for neutrality. Either one is performing or one is failing. This logic leaves little space for genuine rest, because rest does not produce proof of value. It only interrupts production. Billy Graham perceived that when personal value becomes tied to performance, rest loses its legitimacy. It does not matter if everything was done correctly. What weighs is the feeling that it still was not enough. The person does not allow themselves to stop, because stopping seems to mean losing importance. This bond between value and effort is rarely questioned. It is learned early, reinforced over time, and seldom revisited. The person grows up believing they only deserve a pause after exhausting themselves, and even then, the pause comes loaded with self-demand. In this way, performance takes the place that once belonged to care. Life continues to function but under constant evaluation, and while personal value depends on how much one produces, rest will continue to feel risky. Not because rest is useless, but because it does not confirm what the person has learned to use as a measure of themselves. Billy Graham carefully observed people who could not rest even after fulfilling everything that was expected of them. He noticed that for many, the problem was not an excess of tasks, but an internal pressure that never switched off. Even when the day ended, the evaluation continued. For him, this difficulty had nothing to do with a lack of faith in oneself or with disorganization. It was related to a deeply rooted idea that personal value needs to be constantly confirmed. When this logic takes hold, nothing that is done seems sufficient for long. There is always the feeling that something was missing, that it could have been better, that the right point has not yet been reached. Billy Graham understood that this type of self-demand often forms in contexts where being strong, responsible, and productive was necessary. People who learned early to handle everything begin to treat themselves with constant pressure. Rest in this context does not appear as care, but as risk. Stopping seems to open space for judgment, internal or external. He also noticed that these people rarely acknowledge their own exhaustion. Fatigue is minimized, rationalized, pushed aside. The focus remains on what still needs to be done, even when there is no real urgency. The mind keeps searching for something that validates the right to stop, something that almost never arrives. This perspective was not accompanied by criticism. It was a human recognition. Billy Graham saw that when someone cannot rest, it is often not because they do not want to, but because they learn to believe that rest must be earned. And when the criterion for earning it is never clear, rest is always postponed. Behind this difficulty in resting, there is a rarely acknowledged fear, the fear of losing value by stopping. The person does not fear rest itself, but what it might represent. If they are not producing, not performing, not striving, doubt arises about who they are in that moment. Stopping seems to put their identity at risk. This fear is rarely conscious. It shows up as restlessness, as the urge to keep busy with anything, as the difficulty of remaining at rest without thinking about the next step. Even when there is no external pressure, the mind keeps the demand active, as if slowing down were dangerous. The person learns to feel safe only when they are doing something. Action confirms value. Effort brings a temporary sense of usefulness. When that is missing, discomfort arises. Not because rest is bad, but because it does not provide the confirmation the person has learned to seek. Billy Graham noticed that in many cases, this fear forms when recognition has always been tied to performance, being praised for enduring, for producing, for not stopping. Over time, the person begins to treat themselves the same way. They only allow themselves to fully exist when they are performing. The problem is that this criterion is never satisfied. There is always more that can be done, always something to improve. And as long as personal value depends on this logic, rest will continue to feel like a risk. Not care, but a threat to one's very sense of importance. Thus, the person keeps moving, not because they want more, but because stopping raises a question they do not know how to answer. Who am I when I am not producing? As long as there is no space for this question, rest keeps being postponed, even when everything has already been done. When resting begins to be associated with loss of value, rest itself starts to be seen as a threat, not an external threat, but an internal one. The person may recognize that they need to stop, but when they try, something reacts. Anxiety arises, a sense of delay, the impression of falling behind while others keep producing. Stopping ceases to be neutral. It begins to feel dangerous. Free time turns into a space for comparison, self-pressure, and judgment. The mind revisits what was done and concludes it is still not enough. Even without concrete pending tasks, a sense of debt appears, as if there were always something to make up for. This state creates a tense relationship with any form of pause. Weekends do not rest. Vacations do not fully relieve. Free moments are filled with activities that maintain a sense of usefulness, not for pleasure, but out of the need to keep feeling valid. Billy Graham observed that for many people, resting triggers more discomfort than working. He understood that this happens when rest is confused with loss of control. Stopping means no longer monitoring one's own performance, and for those who live under constant self-pressure, that feels far too risky. Thus the person remains in motion, even when there is no real urgency, even when the body asks for a pause. Rest is postponed, fragmented, or experienced with guilt, not because it is not desired, but because it has been associated with failure, delay, or neglect. In this context, resting ceases to be care. It becomes something to be avoided. And while this association remains active, continuous effort feels safer than stopping. Even when everything has already been done, the threat felt is not external, it is internal. This way of self-demand does not form in isolation. It is reinforced by the environment one lives in. There is constant praise for those who produce more, endure more, deliver more. Rest is rarely seen as part of the process. It is treated as an unproductive interval, something that must be reduced or justified. In this context, the person learns to measure themselves by the pace they can maintain. Always being busy becomes a sign of importance. Being tired becomes a sign of valid effort. Those who stop too much risk appearing less committed. Even when no one says this explicitly, the message is absorbed. Self-pressure finds fertile ground in this environment. The external standard of performance is internalized. The person begins to demand from themselves what they believe the world expects. They do not rest because they feel they have not yet reached the right level. And that level is rarely clear. It shifts, rises, and moves. Billy Graham understood that many internal pressures are not born solely from the individual, but from the way human value is often associated with productivity. He observed that when a culture exalts constant performance, rest begins to feel like an exception, not a necessity. This creates a difficult conflict. The body asks for a pause, the mind agrees, but the learned pattern says that stopping is a waste of time. The person feels divided. Even when they try to rest, they carry the feeling that they are failing somewhere. In this way, the culture of performance does not only encourage continuous effort, it makes genuine rest difficult. And while this pattern is not recognized, the person keeps demanding more from themselves, even when everything has already been done. Not by conscious choice, but because they learned that value and rest do not go together. When an opportunity to stop finally appears, rest does not deliver what it promises. The body may slow down, but the mind remains active, evaluating, comparing, reviewing. The person sits, lies down, tries to relax, and soon the feeling arises that they are wasting time. Rest happens, but it is not fully lived. There is a constant restlessness, a background thought saying that something still should be done. Even in free moments, the mind looks for tasks, plans, unfinished business. Rest becomes just a change of activity, not a real pause. There is no surrender, only a temporary interruption. This difficulty does not come from an inability to relax, but from the self-demand that follows the person at any pace. Stopping does not bring relief because the pressure continues. The person rests but watches themselves resting. They evaluate whether they deserve it, whether they overdid it, whether they have already gone beyond the allowed limit. Billy Graham noticed that in this state, rest loses its restorative function. He understood that having free time is not enough when the mind remains trapped in rigid criteria of value. The body may stop, but the inner world continues to demand. Over time, this generates frustration. The person tries to rest and feels that they cannot even do that properly. The pause becomes another reason for self-criticism. Instead of renewing, it wears them down even more. Rest starts to be avoided not because of lack of time, but because it does not bring real relief. Thus, even when everything is done, the person remains tired. Not from too many tasks, but from the inability to stop without guilt. Rest exists, but it is not enjoyed. And this inability reinforces the idea that stopping does not work, keeping the person trapped in continuous effort. Here, the pace slows down on purpose, not to organize everything at once, nor to offer any immediate answer, just to create a space where self-demand does not have to command every thought. When self-pressure is constant, even rest becomes a task, and that is more exhausting than the work itself. There are people who no longer know what it is like to stop without monitoring themselves. Even when they try to rest, they keep evaluating themselves. They wonder if they have done enough, if they are abusing the pause, if they should be using that time better. The mind does not follow the body. It remains on alert. Perhaps it is possible simply to notice this state without trying to fix it right now. To notice how rest has become something that needs internal authorization. To notice how the pressure no longer depends on deadlines or people. It is already installed, functioning on its own. This pause does not ask for immediate change. It does not ask for permission to rest better. It only asks for recognition. To recognize that stopping became difficult because for a long time it was necessary to keep functioning above the limit. The demand did not come out of nowhere. It was built in the name of responsibility, survival, maintenance. Here, it is not necessary to ask how to rest correctly, nor when this will improve. It is enough to admit that resting has become complicated, that something simple has started to feel wrong, and that this says a lot about the weight that has been carried, even when no one else is demanding anything. Over time, the pressure stops coming from outside. It moves inside. The person no longer needs external pressure to keep demanding more from themselves. Even alone, even without deadlines, even without supervision, the mind maintains the same rigid pattern. Effort becomes automatic. This internal pressure is difficult to question because it seems to be part of identity. The person sees themselves as responsible, committed, reliable, and they fear that if they slow down, all of that will be lost. Stopping seems to put at risk the image they have built of themselves. Billy Graham observed that this kind of self-pressure is often harsher than any external demand, because it has no set ending time. It is not satisfied by results. It always finds something to correct, improve, or anticipate. Even when everything has been done, it remains active. This state creates continuous wear. The person feels they never reach a point of permission. There is no clear moment when it is acceptable to stop. The criterion keeps changing. The standard rises. The bar never comes down. What makes it most difficult is that this pressure is rarely recognized as a problem. It is confused with character, discipline, strength. Questioning it feels risky, as if reducing the demand meant becoming a worse person. While this logic remains intact, rest will continue to be experienced as a threat. Not because resting is wrong, but because the person learned to exist under constant evaluation. And while everything is measured, weighed, and compared, there is no real space for pause. At some point, the demand stops being just a behavior and begins to define who the person believes they are. They do not see themselves merely as someone who is self-demanding. They see themselves as someone who must demand from themselves in order to remain valid. The demand becomes identity. At that point, resting does not only threaten productivity, it threatens the internal self-image. If I do not demand from myself, who am I? If I stop, what is left? These questions are not clearly formulated, but they guide decisions and attitudes. Billy Graham noticed that many people maintained high standards, not because they wanted more from life, but because they did not know how to exist without pressure. The demand became the way they found to feel in control, on track, in the expected place. The problem is that rigid identities are exhausting. They do not allow variation, they do not accept pause, they do not recognize limits. The person begins to relate to themselves like a severe supervisor, never satisfied. Even achievements lose their value quickly. Soon another goal appears, another obligation, another not yet. This identity, sustained by demand, creates a functional life, but a tense one. Everything moves, but nothing relaxes. Rest seems incompatible with who the person believes they need to be. Recognizing this does not mean abandoning responsibilities. It means seeing the cost of defining oneself solely by effort. When demand becomes identity, resting stops being care and starts to feel like betrayal. And that makes life heavier than it needs to be. After looking at all of this, there is no immediate solution to offer. The difficulty in resting is not resolved simply by decision. It is tied to how the person learned to relate to themselves over time, with pressure, vigilance, and little space to fail or stop. Some people have lived this way for so long that they no longer know what it would be like to rest without guilt, not because they do not deserve it, but because they never allowed themselves to. The demand occupied all the space. Rest was always left for later, conditioned on a standard that never closes. Billy Graham used to observe these conflicts without rushing to correct them. He understood that some human issues ask for more understanding than solutions. Recognizing that self-pressure was built out of necessity changes the inner tone. The person stops treating themselves as defective and begins to see themselves as someone who learned to demand from themselves in order to survive. This recognition does not solve everything, but it changes the starting point. The demand stops being seen as an absolute virtue and begins to be perceived as something that also exhausts. And that opens space for a more honest question. How long is this pace sustainable? Nothing needs to change right now. Rest does not need to be perfect. Perhaps the first step is not to rest better, but to stop blaming yourself for finding it difficult to stop. Sometimes reducing demand begins like this, by recognizing that resting was never simple, because being enough never seemed possible. If you feel that you demand too much from yourself, that resting always comes with guilt and a sense of insufficiency, I suggest that you subscribe to the channel, because this space was created to help understand where this constant pressure comes from and how it affects rest, personal value, and the way of living. Here, the reflections follow a calmer, more direct, and more human rhythm, inspired by the way Billy Graham observed people who carried more than they appeared to. By subscribing, you gain continuity, content that helps you think without hurry, reduce self-pressure, and see rest not as failure, but as part of life. And if you wish, the comments remain open as a simple space for expression. Sometimes putting this into words is already a sufficient beginning.